أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، وصل اللهم على سيدنا ونبينا محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المكرمين الغرر الميامين، سيما بقية الله في الأرضين وحجته على الخلائق أجمعين، سيدنا وإمام زماننا وصاحب نعمتنا مهدي هذه الأمة وطاووس أهل الجنة، الحجة ابن الحسن العسكري، فداه أرواح العالمين. اللهم كن لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة، وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا، حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. For the hastening of the reappearance of the Master, the Savior, the Avenger, Al-Hujjat ibn al-Hasan al-Askari, recite aloud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. My dear brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. One of the topics that has recently gained a great degree of prominence and has become somewhat controversial in that there are many opinions, conflicting views that are being thrown around. In recent times is the topic of Taqiyah, and what is often translated in English as dissimulation. Perhaps the reason it's gained prominence is twofold. First of all, because of the proliferation of the means with which we can express our views, the emergence of social media, the ability to reach practically anyone on the face of the planet instantaneously, to broadcast our views and opinions to potentially millions of people. That is one reason why the discussion around Taqiyya has become so relevant. What can we say on these major public platforms? Media used to be limited and constrained within the exclusive domain of governments. It was something that was beyond the reach of the average individual. No one could broadcast their views to people around the world up until fairly recently. And so the question of what we can and cannot say is now on the minds of so many people. On the other hand, the second reason why this topic is so relevant today is because while people's access to social media and other broadcast mediums has become so prevalent and so widespread, the limitations of our speech, of what can and cannot be expressed, are things that fall within the domain of ignorance. So many people don't know what they get to say and what they must refrain from saying. And so now is a time for us to understand what taqiyya is, whether it forms an integral part of the skeleton of our faith, or whether it's an exception to the rule. And as many people have been arguing recently, especially those with prominent positions, those that we might refer to as media personalities and influencers, many of them argue that taqiyya is an exception, not the rule. Taqiyya falls within the periphery of our religious rulings. And so I find it important and relevant to discuss this matter, especially within the context of the event that we are all gathered to commemorate. And it's often during the Ashura of Fatima az-Zahra, during Fatimiyya, that this topic resurfaces, and we find many people discussing both for and against it. So, what is taqiyya? And is it an integral part or merely a peripheral component of our faith? How important is this topic to begin with? Well, to answer that, I will begin by reading to you actual quotes from our religious scriptures. Let's find out what God, the Prophet, and the Imams have said about taqiyya. The definition, I think, is rather obvious to most of my audiences. Taqiyya is to conceal the truth and either project a false image to the audience, to the people that you interact with, or simply not reveal what you actually believe in. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about taqiyya in numerous verses of the Holy Quran, sometimes in the context of stories that occurred during the time of Rasulullah, but also other prophets. So I'll begin by referring you to volume 72 of the great compendium of religious quotes and traditions known as Biharul Anwar, by the late and great luminary of this science, Allama Muhammad Baqir al-Majlisi. Biharul Anwar, for those of you who don't know, is one of our biggest collections of hadith, and one that represents one of the backbones of our religious ideology, our understanding of the faith, in which Allama al-Majlisi compiled 110 volumes filled with the traditions of the Ahlul Bayt, categorized in countless topics and categories, each beginning with relevant verses from the Holy Quran. So it's not just a a collection of ahadith, but also the verses that are relevant to each topic of hadith. Volume 72 includes a chapter that Allama al-Majlisi has entitled Babu Taqiyyati wal Mudarat, the chapter on dissimulation and the good treatment of others. This chapter is incredibly important if you are interested in the topic of taqiyya. If you want to explore this discussion further, that I would refer you to this chapter, including the commentary of Allama al-Majlisi, which is pivotal and critical in understanding and contextualizing those ahadith. In this chapter, he mentions a great deal. He then tell his people that I'm ill. Is that, God forbid, a lie? Could God's prophets lie? Obviously not. They're infallible. So either this is a lie, which of course is far from the position of a prophet, or it's something else that we don't quite understand. But the Imam clarifies. He says, Ibrahim told them that I am sick. But in reality, he wasn't referring to a sickness or an illness that had befallen him then and there. He was referring to the sickness of death. In other words, he insinuated to them that he was ill and therefore couldn't join them on that trip. But what he meant was that I have a sickness within me which will ultimately kill me, and that's death. There is no escape from death. قَالَ إِنِّي سَقِيمٌ was a form of taqiyya. That's one occasion when Ibrahim practiced dissimulation. The other occasion is when he stayed back. He did so to demolish the idols. He went to the temple, he broke them all, he destroyed them. Then he hung the axe with which he broke all the idols around the neck of the biggest one, the biggest idol. So when they came to him, they said, obviously, you're the one who destroyed all of these. Number one, because we had all left the city, you were the only one who stayed behind. Number two, because you always spoke ill of the idols. You always said that we shouldn't worship these idols, that these are false deities. So you're the only one who had a vendetta against them. In fact, traditions tell us that when he used to work for his uncle, Azar, and his uncle used to be a sculptor of idols. That's literally what he did. Then he would give it to Ibrahim and say, deliver this idol. He was like a delivery boy for the idols. And what he did was, obviously he's just a child, he has no choice. He's got a polytheistic uncle who is also his foster parent. He has no choice but to do this. But what he used to do was that he would tie the leg of the idol with a rope, and he would drag it along the streets and alleyways of the city, through the mud, through the dirt. And by the time, so he wasn't really a very good delivery boy for the idols. By the time he would deliver it, it's dirty and it's broken and it's shattered. So who's the first suspect when it comes to identifying the one who destroyed all of our idols? It's got to be Ibrahim. His response was what? He said, بَلْ فَعَلَهُ كَبِيرُهُمْ. He said, the one who destroyed all the idols was the big one up there. Now, is that a lie or is that something else? The Imam says that was also a form of taqiyya. It was a taqiyya, number one, to protect Ibrahim as much as possible. Number two, it was a rhetorical point that would try and ignite their faculty of the intellect. When you say that the big statue destroyed all the other idols, their instinctive response is to say, how could he have destroyed them? That's just an idol. And right then and there, he would destroy their entire religious system. Because if he is incapable of moving, even to the extent where he would destroy his competition, then how could you worship him as a god? The Imam says that was another time that Ibrahim practiced Taqiyya. Again, we're talking about taqiyya not just in the context of Islam, but taqiyya that was practiced by prior prophets. Who else practiced taqiyya? The Imam says Yusuf alayhi salam. Where? Remember when Yusuf, his brothers came to him. He's now the king of Egypt. They come for some food and supplies and whatnot. He sees his brother Binyamin, who saved him from being killed and slaughtered, and instead told his brothers that if you want to get rid of your brother, just throw him in the well instead of killing him. Just leave him in the well. He might as well just die there, but don't stain your hands with his blood. So Binyamin was an ally of Yusuf. And later on, all the prophets of the Israelites were the descendants of Binyamin as opposed to Yusuf, but that's another story for another day. So what did Yusuf do? Long story short, Yusuf left the king's goblet, the royal cup, in the bag of Binyamin. He hid it there. When the caravan moved out, a herald came out, an announcer came out, and said, أَيَّتُهَا الْعِيرُ إِنَّكُمْ لَسَارِقُونَ. You are thieves. They stopped. They're like, what did we steal? And they said that you have taken the king's goblet. Now, the Imam says, when Yusuf said that you are thieves, surely he was the one who put the goblet, he was the one who put the cup in the luggage of his brother Binyamin. Why would he accuse them of theft? The Imam says that what Yusuf meant was that you are the thieves of Yusuf who stole him from his father. He wasn't even referring to the goblet, which is something that, it's a concept that falls under the banner of taqiyya. It's called tawriyah. Tawriyah is to say something, insinuate and suggest one thing, but mean something else, which again falls under the topic of taqiyya. So, this all suggests what? That taqiyya is part of every religion, which is interesting. Because while there are differences between religions, even though I don't like the term religions in the plural, there's only one religion in sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the deen, and Allah what? Al-Islam. It's people who then came and manipulated and distorted and changed God's message and created all these different pluralities of religions, right? But for lack of a better term, among all of the faiths and religions and revelations, there are many, many differences, but there are consistent themes. There are things that apply universally. One of those is taqiyya. Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, again speaking about the importance of taqiyya within the traditions of the Ahlul Bayt, which might come as a shock to many of you. Listen to these ahadith. The Imam says, مَا عُبِدَ اللَّهُ بِشَيْءٍ أَحَبَّ إِلَيْهِ مِنَ الْخُبْءِ. Allah has not been worshipped through any means that is more beloved to Him than hiding your faith. Notice the words of the Imams. Allah has not been worshipped by anything that He loves more than concealing your faith. Al-khub is to hide something. So they asked the Imam, Mal khub, what does that mean? The Imam said, At-Taqiyyah, which reinforces the notion. What else? I'll move down the list very quickly. Imam al-Sadiq once again says, إِنَّ تِسْعَةَ أَعْشَارِ الدِّينِ فِي التَّقِيَّةِ. 9/10 of religion is in taqiyya. Which means that taqiyya, as I said earlier, isn't something that falls in the periphery of religious instructions. It's not an exception to the rule. It is the rule. And that's a critical point to keep in mind. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Thank you so much. Another louder salawat. So, إن 19 الدين في التقية. Then the Imam adds another point. He says, وَلَا دِينَ لِمَنْ لَا تَقِيَّةَ لَهُ. And the one who lacks taqiyya has no religion. So that pretty much settles the question. Is this the rule or is it the exception to the rule? No, it is the rule. 9/10 of our religion. It's no joke, brothers and sisters. The Imam al-Kadhim, Musa ibn Ja'far, has a series of instructions which, inshallah, at some point, I think it's important for this will of the Imam, if you like, or this advice of the Imam would be elaborated on and explained and discussed in a series of lectures. The Imam gave these to one of his companions known as Al-Mufaddal ibn Umar. And he told Al-Mufaddal that I want these instructions to be written down and handed among the youth, and they should constantly read them. So not just read them once or listen to them once, but actually have them in their prayer mat, the Imam says. In other words, once you finish your salah, you do your taqibat, you recite tasbihat Fatima to Zahra, and you also have a quick read through these instructions. In those, the Imam talks about the importance of taqiyya and mudarat. And as I said, mudarat means to treat others, people who are outside the fold of our faith, with kindness and in a cordial manner. The Imam says, read these constantly. What else? The Imam says in that wasiyah, he says, إِذَا عَمِلْتَ بِالتَّقِيَّةِ, if you practice dissimulation, فَإِنَّهَا الْحَصْنُ الْحَصِينَ, it is the protective shield. You see, in any war, in fact, in any time of peace, what is more important than developing an arsenal of weapons that you could use to fight your enemy? It's to have a good defense mechanism. What's a rocket if you don't have the ability to defend yourself against enemy rockets? You have to have the means with which to shield yourself from enemy onslaught, from enemy attacks. The Imam says that one of the most important layers of protection for a believer or a community of believers is taqiyya. That's why he says you must practice taqiyya. Imam al-Rida, again, notice how I've kind of picked a hadith from different imams to show you that this is a very persistent and consistent theme. It's not an exception, it is in fact the rule. Our 8th Imam says, La deena liman la wara'a lah. The one who lacks piety, those who don't fear Allah in the face of sin, they have no religion. That's kind of obvious. If anyone who is faced with a sinful act finds themselves slipping right into that trap, where is your religion? Where's your piety? Where's your fear of God's retribution? La deena liman la wara'a lah. The Imam then says, Wala imana liman la taqiyyata lah. And the one who does not have taqiyya, does not practice taqiyya, has no faith in their heart. I could say until kingdom come that I'm a believer, I'm a mawla'i, I'm a lover of the Ahlul Bayt, I'm a hater of their enemies. I could say that all I want. The Imam says if you don't practice taqiyya, it's all a lie. It's a show. It's a means to get likes and views is what that is. You have no faith. You have no iman. It's not my words, it's the words of our 8th Imam. Then the Imam says, La imana liman la taqiyata lah. Then he refers to a verse in the Quran. This is stunning, brothers and sisters. The verse in the Quran, which many of you are familiar with, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Inna akramakum indallah. What is it? Atqakum, right? You've all heard the verse and you know the translation. It means, verily, those who are most honored with Allah are who? Atqakum. How is atqakum translated? It translated as the one who possesses more piety, taqwa. Imam al-Rida alayhi salam translates the verse, or perhaps more accurately I should say, the Imam practices ta'weel of the verse in a different way. He translates the verse, the word taqwa, into taqiyya. He says, Inna akramakum indallah a'malakum bit-taqiyya. The one who is most honored in sight of Allah is the one who practices taqiyya the most. Allahu Akbar. Nowadays, unfortunately, again, with the proliferation of mass media, social media, and so on, if we saw someone who breaks the rules of taqiyya, who violates dissimulation, we see them as being brave. We see them as being courageous. Whereas the Imam is saying, no. The one who practices taqiyya that you might perceive as being a coward, he is most honored in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You see how the mechanism with which we evaluate people has been turned over on its face. Then he says, the Imam speaks about the importance of taqiyya. Then he's asked a question, which again is quite relevant. You hear it nowadays. They say to the Imam, until when? How long do we have to keep practicing taqiyya? We've been doing it for 14 centuries. Isn't it high time that we express ourselves, that we come out as the true, courageous, brave followers of the Ahlul Bayt, speak our minds? We now have the means, don't we? We now have the strength, we have the numbers. How long do we have to keep doing this? Isn't it time that we stop this humiliation? They're killing us anyway. You've heard these things. So they say to the Imam, but how long? Now, before I tell you the Imam's answer, I want you to think about the fact that Imam al-Rida was what exactly at the time? Imam al-Rida, was he imprisoned? Is that why he said the most honored one in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who practices taqiyya the most? Was he in some kind of military fortress? The Imam was the crown prince. In other words, at least on face value, the Imam wasn't in some kind of imminent danger. Yes, he was in danger. Ultimately, he was assassinated. He was poisoned to death. But at least at face value, it wasn't like that. So they asked him, how long do we have to keep doing this? The Imam said, إِلَى يَوْمِ الْوَقْتِ الْمَعْلُومِ يَوْمَ خُرُوجِ قَائِمِنَا, until the day that has been predetermined, the day of the rise of the Mahdi. Meaning that taqiyya never stops. Not until that day. In fact, we have a hadith in which the Imams say, كُلَّمَا اقْتَرَبَ هَذَا الْأَمْرِ, the closer this affair, this matter gets, meaning the rise of the Imam, كُلَّمَا كَانَ أَشَدَّ لِلتَّقِيَّةِ. أشد للتقية could be translated in different ways. Either the Imam is saying taqiyya becomes harder, becomes more difficult, or it could mean the more important it becomes, the more critical taqiyya becomes. And both would be accurate. And it could be both. Until the rise of the Imam himself. Then the Imam adds another incredible caveat. He says, because Taqiyya has to continue until the rise of the 12th Imam, فَمَنْ تَرَكَ التَّقِيَّةَ قَبْلَ خُرُوجٍ of knowledge on their way to achieving salvation, or they are a flock of animals or flies buzzing over the nostrils of a goat. In other words, people who aren't seekers of knowledge and who are not righteous scholars themselves, what could they possibly be? They're lost. They're like sheep, right? That famous hadith begins with a statement which I want you to think about. Amir al-Mu'mineen takes Kumail, who was one of his most, trusted confidants. Kumail wasn't your average Kufan. Kumail was someone who was ultimately killed for his love for Amir al-Mu'mineen. Kumail was a great companion. Yet the Imam says to him, he puts his hand on his chest, meaning the Imam's chest. The Imam then let out a sigh of pain. And then he said, Ahin innaha huna la'ilman jamma law wajadtu lahu hamala. There is immense knowledge in here. I only wish I had people who had the capacity to carry it. Meaning that there is so much that I can't even share with you, O Kumail. There are things the Imam couldn't share with Maytham al-Tammar. The Imam couldn't share with Ammar ibn Yasir. In other words, the Imams practiced Taqiyya with their own followers. Salman would practice Taqiyya with Abi Dharr. We have traditions that say if Abu Dharr knew everything that Salman knew, Abu Dharr would lose it. Abu Dharr. So Taqiyya doesn't just apply in times of danger. When you're faced with some kind of an existential threat that's coming from enemy sources. No, sometimes between brothers and sisters. Taqiyya could also apply. Taqiyya applies not just in the event of an imminent threat. Sometimes our scholars and even companions of the Imams would practice Taqiyya in assuming positions within tyrannical governments. The famous example of that is Ali ibn Yaqtin. Remember, Ali ibn Yaqtin, his father Yaqtin, was a close friend of the Abbasid dynasty. He was a Shia. And they didn't know that he was a Shia. So he practiced Taqiyya throughout his life, imagine. By the way, I know people today in certain countries, which I shall not name, who practice Taqiyya throughout their lives. Someone once came to me. He said that the only person I know in the country that I'm from who is also a Shia is my wife. The only person. Even though there are other Shia. But he said, we practice Taqiyya to the extent that we don't know each other. And so, Yaqtin practiced Taqiyya throughout his life. He got close to the Abbasid caliphs. Ali ibn Yaqtin grew up in that environment, and so they trusted him. Not only did they trust him, Ali was a brilliant managerial mind. He was someone who was incredible in managing institutions, very large ones. And that's why when he grew up, he was appointed as the prime minister of Harun. The prime minister at the time was like the president, right? The Khalifa, the king, would just be like a figurehead. He was someone who would just enjoy his life and drink all night long and, go to bed with as many women as he possibly could. He was just there for the fun of it. But the one who ran the day-to-day business of an empire that spanned 50, 60, 70 countries of today was Ali ibn Yaqtin. Ali ibn Yaqtin sends a letter to Imam Musa ibn Ja'far. He says to him, يا ابن رسول الله لقد ضاق صدري من خدمة هؤلاء الطغاة. My chest is weighing down on me from being in the service of these tyrants. If you give me permission to resign, I have a little bit of money that I've saved up. I will go buy myself a small house in Kufa somewhere and live out the rest of my days. I don't want to be in this position. Remember, he's resigning from the highest political office of one of the biggest empires that history has ever witnessed. Will you give me permission to resign from this? I don't want to be in the presence of these filthy animals. The Imam said to him, لا أجيز لك ذلك. No, I will not give you permission. Incidentally, one day the Imam wrote to him. He wrote a letter which was very odd as far as Ali ibn Yaqtin was concerned. He said to him, من موسى بن جعفر إلى علي بن يقطين. Today, I want you to perform wudu and do so like this. Wash your face, then wash your hand from your fingertips down to your elbow, then wipe your head, and then wash your legs, your feet. Wash them, not wipe them. Ali ibn Yaqtin, as the obedient follower of his Imam, he did exactly as he was told. Later, it turned out that Yahya al-Barmaki, who was one of the advisors of Harun, had told Harun that, look, your prime minister is a Shia of Musa ibn Ja'far. And if you want the proof of that, simply observe him in secret while he performs wudu. So Harun was hiding, observing Ali ibn Yaqtin to see how he would perform wudu. He did so in this manner as a form of taqiyya. Then he went back to his advisor, Yahya al-Barmaki. He said to him, I will never accept your advice against Ali ibn Yaqtin from this day forward. You lied to me. You said he's a Shia. I just saw him perform wudu just like the rest of us. Then Imam Musa ibn Ja'far wrote another letter to Ali ibn Yaqtin, and he said to him, from this day forward, perform your wudu the way you have always done. May Allah bless you. So, Ali ibn Yaqtin assumes the position of the premiership of Harun because of taqiyya. He said to the Imam once, he said to him, Yabna Rasulullah, I don't want to be here. The Imam said, no, ittaqillah, fear Allah. He said, what do you mean, Yabna Rasulullah? He said, you are meant to be here to protect the affairs of my followers. I want you to look after my Shia. That's one example. But there are many, many others. For instance, you have the likes of Al-Khaja Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, who happened to exist and live in one of the most critical times, the fall of the Abbasid Empire and the Mongol invasion of Iraq and the Muslim world. At this critical juncture, when the Mongols came, and these were barbaric savages, they would kill at a heartbeat. They took all the contents of the libraries of Baghdad, threw them all in the river Tigris, turning the water into dark blue from all the ink. They burnt down libraries and religious institutions and mosques. They were Buddhists. They destroyed the most important institutions within the Muslim world because they were savages. Khaja Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, he played this incredibly smart role in which he neutralized the Mongols as well as the Abbasids prior to him, and ensured that within a few generations the Mongols not only became Muslim but became Shia. How often do you find an invading army, a colonial force that assimilates into the local culture, not the other way around? And that was all through the genius of our scholars, through taqiyya. The way our scholars would address these people might make many of you uncomfortable. If I actually read to you what the likes of Allam al-Majlisi, for example, would say to the Safawi rulers of his day, it would make you uncomfortable. I guarantee it. You'd be like, come on, you're taking this way too far. You don't have to say this. Like, you could say whatever you want, but then for you to say that I hope that the Safawi Empire lasts until it hands over the mantle of government to Imam al-Mahdi, that's kind of taking a step too far. Allama al-Majlisi would in fact pray to Allah and say that I pray and hope and even think that this dynasty will last until the rise of the 12th Imam. The way they addressed these rulers was something that would make many of us icky. Which is why you have the likes of Ali Shari'ati, who speaks about Allama al-Majlisi, and he says that these people didn't follow the Alawi Tashayyu'. He says, he calls it the Safawi Tashayyu'. He's got a whole book about it. He says the Safawi Tashayyu' is what the likes of Majlisi had, which was a pacifist, assimilationist form of Tashayyu' where you would give in to these rulers and give them their rubber stamp of approval, so they get to rule and they get to enjoy themselves and they get to wreak havoc, right? That's not the Tashayyu' of Ali ibn Abi Talib. He says the Tashayyu' of Ali ibn Abi Talib was that of Abu Dharr, right? He says Abu Dharr, who came out and spoke out against the third Khalifa. That's the true Tashayyu'. Who says that? Ali Shari'ati. However, he couldn't be farther from the truth. Why? Number one, if you're going to cherry pick and say, oh, Abu Dharr is the example we need to follow. Well, what about Salman? In fact, what about Amir al-Mu'mineen? If Abu Dharr is the only path and the only example for emulation, well, Abu Dharr lived in the time of Amir al-Mu'mineen. Why didn't Amir al-Mu'mineen rise up during the reign of the first three Khulafa? Why did he choose to stay in his home? Why did he spend his time digging deep wells instead of giving sermons in the masjid, for example? You can't cherry pick. You have to see what the Imams did and said. You have to have a holistic view of religion. You can't just pick Imam Hussein's example like the Zaydis do. Zaydis' famous quote that you hear and you see in Zaydi literature is that an Imam isn't the one who sits in his home. An Imam is the one who rises with the sword. يَأْمُرُ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَى عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. But that's something we don't subscribe to. We have to follow the example of our own Imams as well as their instructions, their teachings. So, to say that Allamatul Majlisi was a sellout is one of the filthiest and worst crimes of the likes of Ali Shari'ati. He was driven by his left-wing Marxist background, right? He was a graduate of the Sorbonne in Paris. He even openly says that my teacher was a Jewish communist individual, and so he had this kind of left-wing ideology, topple regimes, revolutions, martyrdom, this, that, without having a holistic view of religion. So you had a lot of people like Ali ibn Yaqtin, Qadi Nurullah Shushtari, may Allah bless his soul. I talked about him in a previous Fatimiyya about 2 years ago under the lecture's title was The Martyrs of Virtue. Learn about Qadi Nurullah Shushtari, or Tustari as he's called in Arabic. Learn about what he did. Learn about the positions that he assumed within non-Shi'i governments and the services he was able to offer because of that. Just like Allama al-Majlisi and others. I'll conclude with One of the most shocking examples of taqiyya, before I wrap up, and again, I wanted to wrap up this topic tonight, but it is quite wide-ranging. The fourth Abbasid Caliph, the first one was Abu al-Abbas al-Saffah, the second was al-Mansur, his brother, al-Dawaniqi. Then you had al-Mahdi al-Abbasi. The fourth one was a person by the name of Musa al-Hadi. By the way, if you're wondering why they have these titles, is because they were referring to traditions of Rasulullah in which he would name or provide the titles of his successors, and they would simply plagiarize them, steal them. Al-Mahdi, Al-Hadi, Al-Rashid, right? They would take these titles and give it to their children to give a sense of legitimacy to their rule. Al-Hadi, whose actual name was Musa, was a savage brute. Once he took four descendants of Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam, and he killed them in the most macabre and brutal manner. He had them whipped until their skins melted. Then he had their feet tied up to the backs of horses and dragged them along the streets of the city until they died. It was so brutal, in fact, that Imam Musa ibn Ja'far alayhi salam fell so ill and had a fever that lasted for 14 days. He couldn't move from his bed. And the Imam cursed the Ansar. And he said that the Ansar gave their pledge to Rasulullah that they would protect his family and his descendants. And yet these four Sayyids, these Alawis, were killed in this way, and nobody lifted a finger. This was one of the crimes of Musa al-Hadi. Musa al-Hadi was also the one who was responsible for the massacre of Al-Harra. Al-Harra or Fakh. Fakh was a rebellion, an armed rebellion, led by a person named Al-Husayn ibn Ali. He was also a Sayyid. He rose up against the Caliph along with 100 of his companions and his supporters. They were all massacred, they were all killed. And Imam al-Jawad has a statement in which he says that after Karbala, no affliction has hurt us the way the massacre at Fakh did. So you kind of have a profile of who this Musa al-Hadi al-Abbasi was. He had a problem with his mother. His mother was a woman named Khayzaran. The problem he had with her is that he wanted to appoint his son, whose name was Ja'far. He wanted him to be the heir to the throne. He was only 7 years old. His mother Khayzaran didn't want this person to become the successor. Instead, she wanted her other son, Harun, to become the successor. She didn't want to be the second lady. She wanted to be the first. So, eventually, historians say that she fed her own son poison, then she suffocated him with a pillow and had him killed. This dysfunctional family created this savage monstrosity. Now he's dead. Imam Musa ibn Ja'far writes a letter of condolence to who? To Khayzaran. Allama al-Majlisi mentions this hadith, and then he leaves a comment at the end which I'll read out to you. Imam Musa ibn Ja'far writes a letter offering condolences to Khayzaran for the death of her son. He says in that letter, he begins by saying, Min Musa ibn Ja'far ila Amir al-Mu'minin Khayzaran. The mother of who? Amir al-Mu'minin. Then he begins by reminding her of the transient nature of this life and the fact that death will take all of us and so forth. Then he says, فَإِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. فَإِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ راجعون. فَإِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ راجعون. What a great affliction is the loss of Musa al-Hadi al-Abbasi. The Imam then says, this is truly a great affliction, a tragedy that can only be compensated by, and we could only console ourselves in the face of this calamity by the fact that we know that the one who will succeed him is Harun. And I pray to Allah to raise your son Musa al-Hadi with Rasulullah. I know what so many of you are thinking, is this even true? Does this even make sense? And the fact of the matter is that if you take this, forget about the chain of transmission and all that. If you take this letter and collect all of the other instances where the Imams and Prophets and other righteous men and women throughout history have practiced Taqiyya, it would make perfect sense. This would buy some time. In fact, one thing that would probably shed some light on this is that one day Ali ibn Yaqtin, before Musa al-Hadi al-Abbasi died, Ali ibn Yaqtin came to Imam Musa ibn Ja'far. He said to him, Yabna Rasulullah, he was crying. He said, Yabna Rasulullah, woe unto me, may I die. The Imam said to him, what's wrong? He said, I heard Musa al-Hadi al-Abbasi saying that tomorrow he wants to kill you. So the Imam read a supplication and he stated to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, repel his harm from me and bury him in the same pit that he has prepared for me. The hadith says, Ma tafarraqa al-jam', that gathering did not disperse before a caller said that al-Hadi had died. The Imam cursed him, prayed against him, and he died right then and there. And perhaps had the Imam not written that letter to his mother, they would have carried on with this wish that he had to kill Imam Musa ibn Ja'far. So to buy some time and so that the Imam could fulfill his divine mandate, the Imam had to practice Taqiyya like this. Allam al-Majlisi then writes a comment. He says, look at the extent that the Imams had to practice Taqiyya, which tells you what kind of pressure they were under. And then he says, this letter is worthy of being studied. This incident is worthy of being studied. And it shows you the extent with which you can practice Taqiyya. Anyway, why do I say all of this? To say that Amirul Mu'mineen practiced Taqiyya after the death of Rasulullah because he was commanded to. Amirul Mu'mineen did not rise with the sword and didn't fight back for all of the reasons that I just laid out to you. Is it now something truly bizarre and out of the ordinary to say that Ali ibn Abi Talib refused to fight back? Especially knowing that Harun, with whom Rasulullah equates Ali ibn Abi Talib when he says, Anta minni bimanzilati Harun min Musa, illa annahu la nabiyya min ba'di. Rasulullah says that you are to me like Harun was to Musa. Well, what was Harun? Harun, was he not brave? Of course he was. He was a prophet of Allah. Was he not courageous? Of course he was. Was he someone who was afraid of death? Absolutely not. And yet, when Musa comes back from the mount, it's right there in the Quran. Stop it with these shenanigans. How could Ali ibn Abi Talib do this? Ali ibn Abi Talib was the strongest man. Of course he was. None of your idols could be compared to Ali ibn Abi Talib. Of course he was. So was Harun. And yet Musa comes back from the mount. He looks at his people. They're worshipping the golden calf. What are you doing? First he goes to his own brother. He says, what happened? Harun's response is right there in the Quran. He says, Yabna إن القوم استضعفوني وكادوا يقتلونني. O son of my mother, meaning my brother, these people, they perceived me as weak. In other words, they left me all alone. They became one big band. I was the only one standing. And had I stood in their face, they would have killed me. Not that Harun was afraid of dying, but Harun didn't want to leave them without a leader. Because in the presence of Harun, if they worshiped the golden calf, God knows what they would have done in his absence. God knows what they would have done. وَكَادُوا أَن يَقْتُلُونَنِي. And so, Harun was patient. Harun refrained from fighting back. So did Ali. In fact, we have a hadith at the level of tawatur, in which Rasulullah says to Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ya Ali, be patient, do not fight back, إِلَّا أَن تَجِدَ أَنصَارًا, unless you find enough supporters, enough people willing to stand up with you, at which point you fight back, yes. But if Fatima al-Zahra has to go door to door, the mistress of the women of the world, the trust of Rasulullah, some traditions state that she knocked on 3. O Abi, did you not hear my father say, Man kuntu mawlah fa aliyun mawlah? Did you not hear my father say, Ya Ali anta minni bimanzilati Harun min Musa? And they would respond to her by saying, Yabnata Rasulullah, had you come to us before we gave our pledge of allegiance to Abu Bakr, لَمَا عَدَوْنَا عَنْ عَلِيِّ ibn Abi Talib. We would never have chosen anyone other than Ali. You're just a little too late. And so Fatima would counter that by saying, وَهَلْ تَرَكَ أَبِي فِي غَدِيرِ خُمٍّ لِأَحَدٍ عُذْرًا. Did my father leave any excuses for anyone after Ghadir Khum? You gave your pledge in Ghadir. It's not that this pledge of allegiance came in a vacuum. I'm not here bidding on my husband's behalf, and you just happen to have given your pledge of allegiance to someone else. You already gave it to Ali ibn Abi Talib. Amir al-Mu'mineen had to practice Taqiyah. However, Fatima did not. Again, inshallah, we'll pick this up tomorrow and explain this a little further. But Fatima had a different role to play. Fatima did not practice Taqiyah. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Why didn't Fatima do Taqiyah? Because when the very essence of Islam is in danger, Taqiyah doesn't apply anymore. When silence means that the very message, the very core of God's religion is going to be forgotten and obliterated, someone has to speak out. Someone has to speak the truth. And boy, did Fatima al-Zahra speak the truth. The way she addressed those people was not just about saying that you stole my inheritance. No. You know what she said? Read her sermon. Fatima al-Zahra spells it out in no ambiguous terms, in the clearest possible manner. She says, Ya ibn Abi Quhafa, أفي كتاب الله أن ترث أباك ولا أرث أبي? O son of Abu Quhafa, do you find this in the Quran that you get to inherit your father and I don't get to inherit my father? In every country, in every culture, in every legal system, when someone dies, their children get a part of the estate. There might be taxes involved, there might be laws that apply, sure. But the heirs, the children, the family of any individual, they get something. And yet this is the only time in all of human history that the family of an individual who is deceased gets nothing. Then she says to him, أَفَحُكْمَ الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ تَبْغُونَ? Are you trying to restore the Jahiliyyah? What worse way could Fatima al-Zahra address someone? You are the custodians of Jahiliyyah. You are the ones trying to restore idol worship, she says to them. Which is the exact opposite. In other words, Fatima spoke out so that Ali doesn't have to. Fatima became a shield for Amir al-Mu'mineen. That's why some people have said that when Amir al-Mu'mineen came to propose to Fatima al-Zahra, Rasulullah said that I'm waiting for God's command. Fatima's marriage is not in my hand, even though I'm her father. I'm the greatest prophet, but I am waiting for God's commandment to come. Every other suitor that came along, every other proposal that was presented, Rasulullah said, I'm waiting for God's command. Eventually, when Ali ibn Abi Talib came, God's permission was sent. Ya Rasulullah, inna as-salama yuqri'uka as-salam wa yaqul zawwij an-nur min an-nur. Marry the light to the light. Whom to whom, Ya Jibreel? He said, Ali min Fatima. No one else was worthy of Fatima al-Zahra except Ali ibn Abi Talib. Well, now, Ali, that you have been granted this privilege of marrying Fatima al-Zahra, what dowry do you have to offer? Amir al-Mu'mineen said, Ya Rasulullah, I have my sword and I have my shield. That's all I have. Rasulullah said, as for your sword, you will need it. This is the sword of Allah that rests in your hand. As for the shield, you will no longer need that. Some have said, Rasulullah was telling Amir al-Mu'mineen that you use the shield to protect yourself. Well, from now on, Fatima will be your shield. Fatima will be the one that protects you. Fatima will be your voice that speaks and breaks the silence so that you don't have to. Fatima will be the one to come to the door so that you are not killed. Allahu Akbar. Amir al-Mu'mineen's bravery was demonstrated on that day. I have said this before. Al-Allamatul Amini says that I spent 40 years of my life studying Ali ibn Abi Talib, studying every nuance, every detail from the life of Amir al-Mu'mineen. But I didn't see the bravery of Ali in Badr and Uhud and Khaybar. Yes, Al-Allama Sayyid Ridha al-Hindi says in his famous poem that if you wish to know the bravery of Ali ibn Abi Talib, Sal Badran, Khaybar, Uhud, ask these battles and you will get to know who Ali was. You will get to know how brave he was. However, Allama al-Amini says that I didn't discover the bravery of Ali on those battles. Instead, I discovered it when the one who plucked open the gates of Khaybar with a divine strength that was embedded in his biceps had to witness a hand rising. He had to witness legs being hurled in the direction of his wife Fatima, had to witness Qunfudh approach her with his whip, and yet be patient because Rasulullah had instructed him to do so. Which is why Amir al-Mu'mineen says later on, many years after that, he describes his state like this. He says, فَصَبَرْتُ وَفِي الْعَيْنِ قَذَى. I was patient even though I felt a thorn in my eye. وَفِي الْحَلْقِ شَجَاء, and a bone in my throat.
أردت راثي نهبايا. I got to see everything that I owned. I got to see the most precious thing in my life being snatched away from me. I got to see my 18-year-old bride Fatima at the mercy of these animals. أجرك الله يا أمير المؤمنين. Amir al-Mu'mineen was the one who, if he heard that a woman had been beaten and thrown outside of her home by her husband, the Imam would show up to the man's house, start by asking him to let his wife back into the house. When the man pushed the Imam saying, "What's it to you? This is my wife," the Imam pulled out his sword, Dhul Faqar, and said, "How dare you abuse your wife the way you have? You have forced her out of your home under the scorching heat of the sun." Amir al-Mu'mineen was the man with that tender heart. If he ever saw a woman being abused, he would come to her rescue. So now imagine what the Imam is going through. بأبي أنت وأمي يا أبا الحسن. Al-Bukhari makes a staggering admission in his book Sahih al-Bukhari. What does he say? You know that one of the names of the day of Qiyamah is Yawmul Jathiyah. Al-Jathiyah means when someone comes and sits on their knees, then they raise their hands like this, which is the ultimate gesture, the ultimate posture of destitution. When you want to pray to God on Laylatul Qadr, you get to do this as well. Sit on your knees and raise your hands like a poor beggar. The day of Qiyamah is called Al-Jathiyah because this is how people will sit before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-Bukhari mentions a statement which is truly painful. It's a damning admission by Bukhari. This is something we need to ask our opponents about. Why does Ali say this here and it's in your own books? Amir al-Mu'mineen says, أنا أول من يجثو أمام الرحمن أخاصم يوم القيامة. On the day of judgment, I am the first person to sit on my knees and raise my hands and say, "Oh Allah, they oppressed me." In other words, I will ask God, I'll be the first person to be allowed to use that moment and say, I was oppressed and I couldn't do anything about it. Imam al-Sadiq says, أول من يحكم فيه. What does Amir al-Mu'mineen ask for on that day? The Imam elaborates. He says, أول من يحكم فيه المحسن بن علي. The first trial that will be held on the day of judgment is that of Muhsin, the son of Ali and Fatima. رحم الله من نادى ومحسنا ومظلوما وشهيدا وعليا وفاطمة. What happened on that day? Even Fatima, she knows how sensitive Ali is to every other oppressed woman. So imagine what would happen to him if he saw what happened to his wife Fatima. And so when she was surrounded by those savages, instead of calling on her husband Ali, She screamed, Ya Fidda, إليك فخذيني فقد والله أسقطوا ما في أحشائي. Fidda, come to me before Ali arrives and sees what's happened. Fidda, come and see, they have miscarried my son Muhsin. Then she turned to Rasulullah and said, Abata ya Rasulullah, أهكذا يفعل بحبيبتك. Look at what they're doing to your sweetheart.